this going. Gonna get my.
Do you want me to record anything on my end?
No, I think I'll be okay. Yeah, I think I'm all good. Don't worry about it. Well, welcome back, John. Good to chat with you again. It feels like a while. Obviously, it's been a while since Leeds were back in the Premier League, and but yeah, no one better to talk to, in my view anyway. When sort of understanding who this Leeds team is, and what we can expect from them this season, let alone on the weekend when we talk about the game a little bit. But yeah, I wanted to ask you actually, casting your mind back to last season, actually. Obviously, a fun one to watch. Leeds obviously securing promotion. I want and just to get your view on your overarching kind of thoughts for that season, like how you felt kind of Leeds played. What what is Leeds like in 2024, 2025 in terms of sort of like our understanding of how they play and how they set up and how they were so successful,
Yeah, I mean, the Leeds of 24-25 is completely different to the Leeds of
right?
25-26. Well, I say that. I think over the course of the summer, I mean, for the last year, Leeds have been running a research department in their I guess in their data department where they've been focusing on the question, how do you survive in the Premier League? um, which I think then has completely determined the recruitment drive they've had over the summer. Um, the conclusions of that study, I mean, I don't know the details of it, but the conclusions based on what we've seen from the recruitment is that physicality and a very specific form of physicality is fundamental to Premier League survival. So something like 6 out of 10
Mm,
players signed were over 6'1", I think even, and the majority of them taller than that as well. And so I think it was very clear from the outset that Leeds were leaning into that that more physical approach. We've seen the role that set pieces can play in terms of bumping up your goal tally if your open play chance creation isn't that high. So again, you're by building a team in that way, you're I guess you're amplifying the possibility of those kind of goals.
yeah.
Um, and then, yeah, I think what we saw from the first few games that Leeds played this season was that they were leaning into this play direct,
Mm,
and we've got hold up strikers in like Lucas Nemecha, Dominic Calvert-Lewin, play direct to them, and you can either then play flick-ons for wingers or you can be well structured for second balls,
mm.
which seems to be a meta in the Premier League this season. And we all know that Liverpool have struggled to deal with second balls.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the opening of the season was very much like against the run of what Leeds had been doing last season, right? Which was largely like trying to possess the ball, trying to um, particularly build up in wider areas. And they still have the capacity to do that. Jaden Bogle, probably the best player Leeds have, I would say, at right back. They brought in Gabriel Goodmanson at left back,
Mm,
another fantastic player as well. So the majority of our technical ball progression is situated in the fullback areas. So after the first few games of winning, playing quite direct, and having good results from that, it seems as though Daniel Farker was like, right, let's against teams where we're expected to compete. Let's try and do that more patient build up, wide progressions in the channels. Trying to do sort of artificial transitions. So still trying to play relatively direct, but by baiting opponents in the wide areas and then doing combinations to get through in behind to try and play cutbacks. And that approach very much didn't work for us in the Premier League. It worked perfectly well in the Championship. And so we ended up with this weird scenario where we played quite well at the beginning of the season, and it just felt as though we'd let all of the advantages we generated in the first few games slip away by playing this more patient approach. Um, until we got to I guess the City game, where Farker was given an ultimatum. You've got to win some points from these two games, City and Liverpool. Sorry, I guess no. After the City game, it was the Chelsea and the Liverpool game that he was given the ultimatum. But in the City game, we obviously went 2-0 down, and trying to play a more patient like build-up game.
yeah.
And in the second half, we came out in this 3-5-2 and then just played direct, and played into the strengths, in my opinion, of the team, which is hold up play. You still got your wing backs now in Goodmanson and Bogle to offer width. but we're really nicely structured
Mm.
to win second balls. You've got the one striker running off the other. And as a result, we caused City a lot of problems. Pulled the game back to 2-2, and then eventually they had to rely on a Phil Foden Perler in order to get out of that game. Um,
You, just to jump in there for a second, because you mentioned like I suppose the real like kind of simplified version of that shift in kind of like tactical approach was last season being much more focused on maybe like a possession game, if you will, that felt like it was more effective in the championship. And then you've spoken there about sort of what has really kind of been apparent in this season, and that actually maybe you can attempt to try and get away with that approach against teams that aren't as intense. Unfortunately, most of the teams in the Premier League are fairly intense and have lots
yeah,
of players in their teams who can, if nothing else, run very hard. And there's some really athletic teams in the league. You mentioned like the recruitment drive in the summer being the output or one of the outputs of this kind of project of how do we survive in the Premier League. Just wanted to, before we talk about this season and go into some of the games and some of the performances that you mentioned there, which of those kind of players that did end up coming in and sort of joining the club do you think are sort of the ones that have caught your eye the most, or actually sort of the most significant signings?
yeah. So I mean, I guess Goodmanson, the left back I've already mentioned,
Yeah.
and again because so many of those other players seem to fit the mold of being like intense ball winners, duel winners,
Hmm.
over, I guess, like tight space technical players. It's easy to focus on Bogle and Goodmanson as the two ones to watch out for. Um, and you know, even in terms of like the wide players that we've been using further up the pitch, we brought in Noah Okafor, and again, even I think he was probably I think he's the only wide forward we brought in, but even still, he has the same sorts of characteristics. Definitely like an intense player, a ball carrier, a runner. Versus, and I guess that fits in with like, you know, we've got Dan James, we've got Brendan Aronson being playing out on the right hand side.
Yeah.
Again, two guys who's I would say have physical traits over technical traits. The only real technical winger we have right now is Willie Nonto, who
Yeah.
hasn't really
Right.
been used that much so far this season. Um, but yeah, elsewhere, I would say everyone else fits into that more sort of physical and physically imposing as well as physical, because I think, you know, Dan James is a physical player, not physically imposing, but the rest of the team now. So we've at times this season we played a midfield of Ethan Ampadu, Sean Longstaff, and Anton Stack, who signed from Hoffenheim.
Hmm.
That's just like a gigantic midfield. That's a like a cheat code second ball winning midfield. And then centre backs too. So brought in Jacobiol from Udinese in Serie A. Brought in Sebastian Bornau of from the Bundesliga. Again, two very sort of box dominant defending centre backs as well. So yeah, Nemecha up front, Calvert Lewin up front, both really good hold up players. Both and you know Nemecha was always only ever meant to be um, uh, I guess a backup. We got him on a free early on and got Calvert Lewin later on. But Calvert Lewin, I think, has really impressed me in terms of his ability to just have the ball stick when we go long. So yeah, in terms of like standout signings, like to be honest, I'm more impressed at the overall picture that they
The
built.
fit. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that that has been confirmed by the fact that when Leeds have played in this more direct style that suits the players, they've looked pretty competitive in this league, right? So yeah, it's not going to be a team that's going to pull up any trees. It's going to be a team who are going to drop points probably against play teams around them, but they are going to be competitive in a lot of games against more technical teams, which I think, you know, the majority of teams in the Premier League are trying to be right now. So yeah, I think they've lent into this new meta that I think we started seeing emerging from Andoni Areola onwards, where I think it became apparent that like the way that you cause problems for teams higher up the league is to try and destabilize them rather than trying to impose your own game style onto the fixture.
Mm.
So maybe that's an interesting thing to talk about, because I think Liverpool have definitely suffered this season from that precise approach.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, like, before coming on to talk about the game in particular, a few things that's kind of jumped out to me. One, um, I like the notion of, people going in depth and studying kind of, okay, what will we need to do to survive in the Premier League? What does the research suggest that we should adopt as our playing style? And then coming out to the conclusion, as you mentioned there, about actually, if we buy players who are big, tall, but also physically intense and can do the required running, and we hoover up those second balls, even if we don't win the actual initial duel. That looks like it's going to be like the direction of travel. Nice to know that you saw that coming because it does feel as though Liverpool didn't necessarily see that coming with the kind of the profile of players they've signed, which almost kind of leans into what you were suggesting there. That actually, no, we will out tech, we will technically outplay our way around this intense style. We are, we're backing players who have higher ceilings in terms of sort of the technical ability to be able to deal with this disruption. And that's, I think, one of many reasons why I think things have been so unstable for Liverpool this season. So I just wanted to ask you, well, you mentioned there a little bit then, that research takes place, the players come in that clearly fit a certain profile. Daniel Farke's record of like coming into the Premier League and then how he's done the Premier League has been an intriguing one because it's often gone quite badly for him. I just wonder what you made of the fact that that work was done, that research was done, kind of the runway was seemingly clear. Why then like take so long to actually adopt that style of play? And you mentioned the ultimatum. I wasn't aware of this kind of it wasn't it kind of an explicit ultimatum that he was sort of aware that he needed to win these games.
I mean, I'm just reporting what was put out in the Guardian, I guess, there
Right.
that he was given, 2 games to turn things around. So
Sure, sure.
yeah, I mean, and it's funny that you say, well, why did it take him so long to do this? I don't think it did. I think he was doing it from the early games of the season, and I don't know. A lot of this is just me speculating, in terms of what's going on behind the scenes. But
Oh, sorry, I thought you said that after the initial burst at the start of the season that there was like a return to a more possession
yeah,
heavy approach,
yeah,
right?
for
Okay.
sure, there was that. Yeah, and like again, speculating on my part, it feels almost to me as though Farker um, w was it felt very much to me that and we know that during the summer there was a lot of conversations about whether or not Leeds would even replace Farker, despite the fact that they'd been promoted that in the
Yeah, I
summer.
remember. Yeah.
And I think a lot of that revolved around this question of will he be able to switch his play style to be able to fit into to coaching a team that is now playing in a very different way to his implicit you know desire to play football, right? And I think that maybe what happened at the beginning of the season was he sort of went into the season with the threat of, you've got to play the way that we need you to play with this squad, um, ringing in his ears.
Hmm.
Um,
Did the
and
classic manager
his
thing of like, no, let me prove to you that my style will work.
right after having had a few good results, no doubt, then felt okay. We've got some easier teams coming up. Let's revert to type and show that we can play possession football. And I think that's where the frustration comes with Farker in that um, I think when this team are playing the way that they've played against Chelsea and when the way that they played against City in the second half, I've no qualms whatsoever about Farker being the coach of this side for the time being, right? To give us stability in this league. I guess I worry in the long run more that when it comes to it's all well and good, right? Playing direct football, shifting to a 3-5-2, um, when you're playing against City and you're playing against Chelsea, and no doubt when we're playing against Liverpool. My question is what happens when we've got through that period and then suddenly again he's back in that situation where he's like, okay, we've got some games against, we've got Brentford coming up, we've got Palace coming up. What does he do in those games? Does he go back to saying, okay, well we can't play direct in these games because the opponent are going to play direct as well, so it'll just become a transitional game, blah blah blah. The question then becomes, does he think, well, let's try and possess the ball, let's try and control the ball in possession a little bit more than we have been doing in these games? And if that happens, do we then end up just sort of being, I mean, yeah, becoming a version of like a good side light, but without the technical players to even be able to make the difference. So you're then sort of playing into the meta from the other direction with a quality of player that's lower, and so it just seems to me that you're obviously going to then struggle against teams like Palace, like Brentford, etc., which are the teams that you really want to be producing points against. And I guess just to finish this thought,
Mm,
uh, you know, we've seen against City and against Chelsea, like yes, you can get like good performances out of this approach, this more direct approach. But against the big sides, like we got lucky a little bit against City and still ended up losing. And then with Chelsea, like everything went perfectly for us in that game. And again, that's what you do when you're a promoted side. You play in a way where you are competitive, and then if the rub of the green goes your way, you pick up points. The worry for me is when you're in games against teams that you should be competing with in a much more even game state, then we're not competing. And that's my worry with Farker is that how many points can you get from being competitive against elite sides and picking up, maybe a draw here or a win there, versus like how many points should you be picking up against the teams around you? We've dropped points to Burnley, we've dropped points to Fulham, we've dropped points to, you know, yeah, we've been sort of lucky to pick up points against some of the teams around us as well. But like, I think that's the bigger question for me is to what extent is this a sustainable approach if we're only playing the way that suits the team in games where we're most likely to lose, even if we play well?
mm. Yeah, it's like in his heart of hearts. If this is how he wants to play football, then it's going to come down to, well, it basically turns the game into a measure of quality and who has the best technical players, and you're not going to come out on the winning side of that if you sort of reduce the game to I'm looking at the results, and again, yeah, those wins against teams around you that you'd want to be seeing. Obviously, only the Wolves win. The win over West Ham, who are truly dreadful so far this season.
And we nearly, I mean, they came back in the
And
second
then it
half
came back in,
against,
yeah.
yeah. Um, exactly. And the Wolves game again, like we XG'd them to use the the modern parlance.
It is the modern
In that
parlance, yeah.
one, like literally everything went in, everything went well for us. But then there was a game against Forest where we managed to go up through the first, like we had a quite speculative shot that went in, and we in that game state we couldn't compete with them. And it's just games like that where I think I worry a little bit more about the way that Fark will see it. So yeah, I guess for me the question going forward is this now him having turned the corner and decided, okay, this is a squad that is better playing direct even against teams at the bottom. And I
Mm.
don't think we can make that judgment of how he'll be going forwards in the other games because we've only seen him really do it in the games against big sides. He'll probably continue in that vein against Liverpool. I don't think that will teach us anything. It's only once we hit the Brentfords and the Palaces that are
Yeah,
coming
that
up
run afterwards,
and the
yeah.
Sunderlands that we really are going to understand like how likely it is for this team to stay in the league, I think.
Hmm. Do you think there's any calculations? I mean, it doesn't really make sense given sort of the recruitment that you've done, but any calculation of if you were to play in the way in which you played against City and Chelsea and presumably against Liverpool as well, that there is a danger of those players kind of not burning out or whatever, or like actually maintaining that intensity of approach like throughout an entire sort of campaign. I mean, you've clearly recruited for it in terms of sort of like having players that seemingly have the ability to handle those loads. But I just wonder, do you think that potentially sort of we're just speculating here, but part of the consideration?
I think it won't be an issue. We're already out of the Carabao Cup.
There's not that many again, yeah.
Yeah, and we were out in the first fixture, right? And then beyond that, it's just kind of FA Cup as far as we go, and then Premier
That
League.
should be fine.
I think Iraola's Bournemouth have proven that with a low schedule, you can play pretty intense football.
Yeah,
So yeah, and I think we have a fairly deep squad in terms of being able to rotate. We've got a few injuries at the moment, but I think yeah, it's not something that I worry about. I
okay,
think that I think any promoted side should really focus on trying to get the physical advantages they can get out of not having as many games.
100%.
Um, and arguably, we're also seeing Manchester United go down that route, right? Realizing that because they don't have European football, that they can almost cheat code their way a little bit by playing this more direct style and more maybe more physically intense style for the time being, just to see if they can get the advantages of that in this season, and then if they get European football, then I guess they go from there.
Sure. So are there specific games that you'd point to? I mean, you mentioned a bunch there. You mentioned sort of the actually some of the luck that went your way in getting some of those wins this season, but then you also mentioned Forest as a good example of um, inability to kind of take advantage of going ahead and sort of being pegged back and ultimately losing that one 3-1. Are there games this season that you can point to and go, that's a wonderful example of like the Farker possession style not proving fruitful. I think the examples of what you mentioned, the more direct approach bearing fruit are pretty obvious, and we'll come on to talk about those as we get towards the Liverpool game. But if someone had never watched any of Leeds this season and wanted to get a pretty good idea of why this season has unfolded as it has, what would be the games that you'd point them to and say, watch this? You can figure out sort of what has been the what's been the issues.
Do you know what's really interesting? I'm just on FB Ref, and I've just sorted the games by possession.
Oh yeah.
Um, and if you do that, the so the top whatever there's 7 or 8 games where they've had the most possession, they've won one, lost six, and drawn one, which ended up being a loss to Sheffield Wednesday. So they had 80% possession in the Sheffield Wednesday game, ended up losing on
Wow.
penalties. And then you've got the Burnley game, 68% possession, couldn't break them down. The Spurs game, 56% possession, couldn't break them down. We won the Everton game on that late penalty, which was maybe a bit fortuitous, although we did play better than Everton for the majority of the first half,
Mm.
54% possession. The Forest game, 54% possession, lost
So it's
3-1.
basically like a linear trend, basically.
Exactly. The games where we've done better have been the ones where we've had much less possession, and I think that's the reality. Um, so yeah, I think that just whistle stop tour through all of the games where we've had 50% possession or more. Brighton lost 3-0, 3 xg. We only created half an expected goal. So whenever we've played in those games where we are given the ball, and we're able to play, we're trying to play patient possession football. It hasn't really gone well, with the exception of the Everton game.
Yeah.
Whereas in the games, we've got the Wolves game, 44% possession. Drew with Bournemouth, should probably have won that game, 41% possession. Drew 0-0 with Newcastle, 43% possession. Beat West Ham, 41% possession. The City game, 40% possession. And then Chelsea, 30% possession, but then won 3-1 quite comfortably.
Yeah. You
Let's
can
not
imagine
talk about the Arsenal game, but yeah.
there's some analysts in the Leeds coaching team who, I mean, if you can get access to that via FB Ref and make the connection, you would hope. There are some
Well,
analysts in the
yeah,
Leeds team who are saying there's a
give
line.
them the ball. Yeah, exactly. And I don't think I'm particularly profound in saying this. I made a video maybe a couple of weeks ago about
Mm,
this, just saying you can almost use goalkeeper kicking as a cipher for how direct Leeds are playing. So, and you can trace the through the season, it was very clear there was like a downward trend. They started off with the goalkeeper going long quite a lot, and the average pass length of the goalkeeper dropped, and the number of launched passes from the goalkeeper dropped. Apart from the West Ham game, interestingly, which it jumped right back up, and we won that game. But
mm,
it's very clear, I think, that it was very clear to everyone watching, the fans included, that Leeds were better in this more direct version. And
yeah.
so the frustration, I think, with Farker was that it wasn't necessarily that Leeds couldn't compete in games or couldn't look very good in games. It was that we weren't having the consistency of finding the best way of playing against oppositions.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I think when you say that and you mention that frustration and you talk about a style that looked well clearer to fans that that there was the way forward and backed up by the data as well, not just sort of the feeling that you get from watching it. Um, that frustration again makes me think, obviously, like shifts us on to Liverpool a little bit in terms of what we've seen this season, and I think it's one of the issues with Liverpool this season is the myriad of issues that exist. There's not one or two things that are currently wrong in my estimation, but one thing that even during that opening stretch of 5 wins out of 5 and the sort of the late winners, one thing that me and a bunch of my friends and some of the colleagues on Anfield Index were talking about regularly was what is the plan? Couldn't see a coherent plan. And then to your point, looking at the profile of players that we signed in our heads, whilst it being still a little bit unbalanced, there seemed a clear way of playing with those players. The fullbacks being a prime example, right? You sign Frimpong, you sign Kirkez. They are road runners. Like they up and down the touch line. Yes, some of them actually may have really improved their final ball, and actually they are, I think, more creative players than people give them credit for as well. However, that is what they would do. They were not bought. You would assume or profiled as, oh, these guys invert really nicely, and they can help us build up coming into midfield just like Trent did, and it's going to be like that. And yet, it took us, I would say, until 3, 4 games ago. Maybe it was the Forest game that I went to actually, where we lost it at Anfield. That was the first game I can remember where Kirkez would overlap and Cody Gakpo would actually pass to Kirkez and recognize that he was there. And the defender suddenly had another thing to think about. It wasn't just going to be Cody cutting in on his right hand side. It was, you had these fullbacks that made sense. And I use them as an example because there's a bunch of different players, I think, in Liverpool's team that quality isn't in doubt, but their fit and how to get the best out of them, or what the plan was to get the best out of them, in my mind, seems muddled. And probably the most generous thing I could say is naive. If there was a certain way in which they thought they were going to connect. I'm sure you've done videos this season as well on kind of what's wrong with Liverpool, and I'm sure your thinking on that may have evolved as as the season's transpired. But as we come into this weekend, where we currently find Liverpool, what's your view? I'm interested in terms of sort of how they've ended up in this situation now where they're playing incredibly, you can see that they're fragile sides. They're playing, trying to play low risk football. It's slow. It's not quick enough. The press seems very disorganized. 120 million pound strikers are not getting frequent touches of the ball. Yeah, I would love your thoughts, and I think as I've gone on there's lots of things we could talk about.
Yeah, yeah. So I've done two videos, two longer videos on Liverpool this season. The first one we did back in September, and it was titled "Should We Be Worried About Liverpool?"
Oh yeah, okay.
which I think was maybe ambitious at the time. Certainly, no one thought we should be, because that was the point at which Liverpool were winning every game, despite the fact that it was a bit squeaky bum at times
It
in that
was.
run. And the focus on that video, I think, was more the stuff that you've been talking about there, right? Which is, this is how Liverpool played last season. This is how their new signings are impacting that. I focused particularly on Florian Wirtz as with just the question in mind: what happens when you take your most creative player from right back and put them in the centre of midfield? Not just that, like what happens when you take your most creative player as a sort of progressive passer who can trigger these tempo shifts that were so good for you last season on the side of Mohamed Salah. And then you replace him with a guy who's, as I call him, like a high volume final third
Yeah,
facilitator.
yeah, yeah.
So a guy who just wants to float around, bounce passes, create little spaces, pockets of space that his teammates or he can exploit, and then play the often the pass before the pass, right? Where you end up like feeding the ball through to someone who can then square it to a teammate. Um, and I think that's the reality of that is stark. Like as you've mentioned, fullbacks replacing like progressive passers, because Robertson is a very good progressive passer as well,
Yeah.
or even like a sort of tight space build-up passer in a way that Kirkez and Frimpong and Bradley even aren't.
No.
Um, we then talk about. I mean, I guess the way that I've talked about it is that for Liverpool, what was happening last season is you were doing a sort of like De Zerbi light approach to build up, right? So moving the ball around the back line with the idea of you could control the ball because you'd have overloads because you're closer to your goal, so you can have more players than the opponent. You've
Hmm.
also got a goalkeeper, right, which means that you are just going to be overloaded. If the opposition then takes the bait and says we're not going to allow that overload to exist, you then have an overload against the back line, right? So you'd have your attacking players forcing the opponent's line back, space in between the lines, and then the point is that when anyone in your back line is under a huge amount of pressure, and it's usually the fullbacks, right? So it's usually fed out to the fullbacks. They then have like four different options for escapes, right? They can either feed it back round to the other side of the pitch along the back line through the centre back or the goalkeeper, or you've got Gravenberch pivoting, or maybe McAllister, depending on the side, who can then receive the ball. And if we've seen it with Gravenberch, if he can spin his player, he's then running into that space that's opened out between the lines for the back for the
Yeah.
opposition. And then, I mean, depending on the side you're on the left hand side, you had often Luis Diaz dropping in, creating space in the wide channel for the
Mm.
for the striker to run into. And I think Luis Diaz was pretty good at receiving those back to goal and then creating
Very
from
good at that.
there.
Yeah.
On the other side, you've got probably Soboslai on the back line, but he can drop off the back line to create space for Salah so that Trent Alexander-Arnold can find those balls in space so that he
Mm.
can make those out to in runs. Um, all of that worked really nicely. But that what has ended up happening this season is those escapes have become much less dependable, much less sustainable, right?
Yeah.
Teams realize that Gravenberch is a really important part of your build-up, so they've made sure that they don't give him any space. You've lost Luis Diaz, and you haven't necessarily replaced. Well, with Gakpo, he's not that kind of player, right?
No,
And as you've said, the fullback isn't engaging with him in the same way. Kirkes was being used as an outside centre back in possession a lot at the beginning of the
really
season.
weird. Really
Yeah,
odd.
very odd.
Yeah.
Soboslai wasn't being started or was being played as a fullback, and I think when he was being played as a fullback, he did at least offer some of that more progressive passing from there. But
He can do it,
again,
but then you deprive the
yeah,
midfield, right?
yeah,
Exactly.
exactly, and you don't have the guy dropping off to engage in the right hand side with those rotations with Salah,
Yeah.
and you also lose your best out of possession player in the center of the field, right? So all of these little things I think started adding up, and it meant that the in possession side of the game was certainly much less convincing than it was last season. On top of which, like teams were just not allowing you the space as much, right?
Yeah, it's interesting 'cause you mentioned the like teams real understanding Gravenberch's importance to Liverpool and how they want to build up. I think obviously no Trent has really exposed that just how yes Van Dijk can help build up. Konate is not as strong at that side of the game and he doesn't have the cheat code anymore passing to Trent to get out of those situations.
Yeah,
You mentioned Luis Diaz nicely actually that like doing a Sadio Mane kind of impersonation. That one of the most useful things about Sadio was if you were in trouble, you mentioned those escape routes, you could just hack it up. You could
yeah,
just really send it to Sadio, and he contort his body in some sort of way to take the ball down, and you made ground that way. Gakpo doesn't really do isn't really that sort of player. I
yeah,
suppose one of the questions I had really early in the season, and it hasn't been answered yet, I don't think, um, and maybe my assumption's wrong here, but when I was thinking about, okay, you get Florian Wirtz, and everyone I spoke to about Florian Wirtz, lots of people in the Liverpool side were like, oh no, I think he'll play on the, he'll play on the left and then he'll drift. I spoke to Seb Bloor around him, and most people who watch him in the Bundesliga, they're like, no, he'll play centrally. You've bought him, you've sold him on that vision that he will play centrally. It's been a long time since Liverpool have played with a number 10, I suppose. Coutinho is probably the most likely comparable player, but still a different player. What I thought when I was looking at that was, do Liverpool actually have the midfield combinations required to allow Florian Wirtz to play in that role in the Premier League? And my hunch was that they didn't, because I didn't think that the pairs that we could put together were necessarily going to be physically strong enough to do the work that was required to allow Wirtz, who's no slouch, to do the work that he does in a creative sense. I then the start of the season we saw Grav drifting forward a lot and actually having some good success doing that. But to my mind, I thought that can't be the plan because you're getting in his way. It's his job. We just bought this player to do that job. You need to restrain yourself and do the defensive job. And I don't want to necessarily do the defensive job. And so it felt like there was a profile missing. And I'm not doing the classic, oh, we need a defensive midfielder thing, but it did feel as though there was a profile missing of really aggressive, defensively minded player, doesn't care about going forward really, or can progress the ball like fairly decently, good at pivoting, receiving the ball back to goal and stuff like that. But it felt like that was a massive hole in the side, and without the Trent kind of cheat code to it, sides would just be able to bully us. And the spaces have been, I think, off the ball has been, I think, my
yeah.
big concern really.
Yeah, and I guess that brings us to the second video that we made more recently, which was can Arne Slot fix Liverpool? And we sort of
Yeah,
broke down because I think on the one hand I agree that and the focus has been on how do you make this work in possession with all of these profiles that don't really fit.
yeah,
I think that's a part of it,
that's part
but
of it. Yeah.
I don't think it's the full picture because I think the issue is that you're slightly less good in possession than you were last season. I think that was always going to happen because I think teams were going to stop you from having the
Yeah.
space that you're
I
attacking.
think we're much more unstable off the ball.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that this is the thing for me is that I think that last season worked so well because you were able to stay in winning and drawing game states for much longer. That approach to football is perfectly fine if you get goals up, right? Because because you then end up in these situations where what you're doing in terms of the big picture strategy is pulling opponents towards you so that you're creating space in behind. And in winning game states, you can do that because teams are like, well, we can't sit back. We have to go for this a bit more.
I
And I
think
think,
Liverpool have won all the games actually where they got ahead this season as well. I think maybe I'm wrong on that, but actually I think that that
yeah,
pattern is again
yeah, right,
when they
exactly.
manage to get themselves in that game state.
Yeah, and I think the issue this season has been the bigger issue this season has been that they've been conceding goals much earlier because teams have now figured out the weaknesses in their defensive approach. I think those weaknesses were there last season. I got panned week in, week out for being like, I think there's issues here. I think there's issues here, and Liverpool kept on winning. But it's because they were able to still mitigate that and operate in a way that where they were generating these goals early on, and then the
Yeah.
game goes into their favor, right?
Because you mentioned people figuring Grav out. I thought teams figured him out at a
Last
stage
season.
last season, to be honest, because he has that one move that you mentioned, which is very good, where he can receive it and then
Yeah,
slide
yeah, yeah.
across. Teams figured that out. They were like, oh, we know what you're going to do. We're just not going to allow you to do that. And the one aspect of his game that I don't think is very strong at all is passing. He's not a progressive passer. He's a dribbler, and he takes multiple touches on the ball. Teams are happy to give him the ball because they know he's not going to hurt them.
Yeah, yeah.
And I thought teams figured that out around January, February in particular. They figured it out, and we noticed it very starkly once Trent got injured against PSG. That he was gone, and all of a sudden, like, and no one really cared. I think is your point because Liverpool were so far
We're so
ahead,
far ahead, right? And everyone was like, "Oh,
and
they're just on the beach." And I think
but,
there was so many indications of what has happened this season off the back of last season. It's easy for me to say in hindsight, but I only mention this because we were talking about this at the time, and we were saying these are
no,
issues.
we
And
were.
and I think that it's always important when you're in a situation where you are going to win the league comfortably. To look at the weaknesses and say where are the problems going to emerge. That's all I treat my job as an analyst to be is to be like this is what a team is doing well. Here's where the problems might arise, and I think we already started seeing them last
So
season.
what solutions do you think Liverpool tried to answer by like because obviously I think that there's lots of clever analysts involved here. They would have done work. It's about trying to foresee where the Premier League would go and problems that they came up against because there seems to be this obsession with low blocks that Liverpool were dealing with, and we need to find a way to cut through these low blocks
Yeah,
because all
yeah,
these teams are playing low blocks against us. And so I can understand it from that side of things, but it does shock me actually that given the pursuit of Caicedo, given the pursuit of Zubamendi, that there wasn't a grab
yeah,
incredibly well that season. You did a really good job for us. We probably should address a profile there to like, yes, we end up with lots of midfielders and lots of people who can do similar things in terms of the eights, but that's just a problem we have to deal with. There's a hole, and the only player who can currently do that job on paper is Wataru Endo, but he cannot do it physically.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so so what problem do you think they were trying to solve by going? There's obviously the post Mo Salah building that's been what seems to be being done as well, like
Yeah,
proactively.
yeah.
But yeah, I love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'm just speculating here. I have no idea the conversations that are going on behind the scenes, but just speaking on again on big picture terms, the reality is that what we've seen from the sort of tactical landscape that's emerged in the last few seasons when it comes to elite sides, the reason why we are in a new tactical like evolutionary
Yeah,
stage. I don't know where it's going to end up necessarily, but what we do know is that the old consensus, I think, that was the Pep Guardiola consensus that elite sides should be able to control games purely through possession, and not just through possession, through territorial dominance, right? So you possess the ball high up, you force the opponent into low blocks, and in doing so, yes, you're making it harder for yourself to attack because like low blocks are harder to break down, but you know that you can force that situation in games because your in possession is so good. And then if you're in a losing game state, the opponent's just going to sit deep anyway, right? So even when you're losing, you're still facing the same problem, right? And so what that meant was that Pep Guardiola could optimize for breaking down low blocks. So his teams were just full of like wildly technical players, and they could mitigate the risk of like counterattacks well enough that it was worthwhile. But what we've started seeing is that balance, the needle has shifted, so that it's less I think it's less valuable for teams to possess the ball high up the pitch because football being such a low scoring game, opponents now have a much higher talent ceiling so that they can hurt you in those transitional moments. So the big question then has been like, how should you play modern football at the elite level when when you're basically faced with the problem of transition? And there's two options there. One of which is like we go even more technical, right? Which I would sort of point to someone like Hansi Flick maybe as an example of that, where they don't have large space defenders in their team, right? And they mitigate that by having a really high line and yes, very physically adept players at counter pressing. But what we started seeing after the first season of Barcelona for Hansi Flick is that teams now know how to manipulate that back line, right? The offside trap becomes very hard to use as a way of doing that. The other option is what Arteta's done, which is load your team full of like physical players. And yes, that obviously there's a load of technical ability in that team, but the technical ability necessarily is going to be lower than it would be than if you were just putting purely technical players in there.
Yeah.
And then the question is, well, okay, that's going to reduce their open play chance creation. Um, on top of the fact that like it's not just that they have like I guess slightly less technical players than they might have, and a lot of their players are like incredibly technically good
It's
anyway.
still really good.
Yeah, but I think that what that means for Arteta then is like, what if we go the opposite direction and we are super risk averse in possession, right? We don't
Yeah.
try and put the ball anywhere that can result in turnovers.
They turn the game into such a low event
Yeah,
game. Yeah.
exactly, and they'll go into the wide areas, and it's kind of like, okay, we're pretty good at progressing the ball consistently down the field. We're not going to end up in dangerous areas a lot because not only because we're playing slower, we're building up slower, but we're also building in the wide areas where it's much less dangerous to possess the ball.
Yeah.
Um, the reason they can do that is because they can offset it with set pieces, right? So that I think that's an elegant solution on the part of Arsenal of being like we can play in the safest way possible, but we're still going to generate enough goals to challenge at the top.
Mm.
But the problem with, I mean, I guess the problem with the Arsenal approach is
Is it sustainable?
it's
Yeah.
yeah it's because you're reducing the amount of goals in games, you just become much more susceptible to variance, right? So if the opposition scores a goal,
Yeah.
then
The
you're in trouble,
Slide,
right? Because yeah,
the
yeah,
Szoboszlai free kick. I mean, I think about it's interesting to me. I think I completely hear what you're saying because in the games I've seen where Arsenal have gone behind, all of a sudden that they look
yeah,
more ragged,
exactly,
and,
yeah,
and you're like,
exactly.
okay, um,
And so I guess then where does Liverpool fit into this picture?
yeah,
Well, it doesn't. It fits much more close to the Hansi Flick approach, right, than the Arsenal the Arteta one, which is I think the opposite direction to the way that a lot of teams are now going in the Premier League.
mm,
That's maybe just a Premier League specific thing right now, but that is the direction of travel, as you said before. So the question then becomes, like why are Liverpool not going in that direction? I think there's other issues we should talk about with the Liverpool out of possession as well, which
sure,
is the inability to compete for second balls. I think it comes
yeah.
from a number of different things. I mean I've just watched the Sunderland game back this morning. I did my due
Well, that's
diligence
that's
and
that's that's fun for you. Yeah,
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 fun for you guys as well, I
uh,
suppose. But like,
yeah.
two things stand out, right? One is that Slot has always been and seems to have been and seems to be not shaking on this position, keen to have a +1 at the back
Yeah,
at all times, which means that you're necessarily operating with a -1 at the front.
exactly.
And yeah, I mean the way that you were playing. The way that you were playing against Sunderland was interesting because it just sort of felt like you were playing a 4-4-2 block for a lot of the time. But then at some point you realised that you were getting played around by Sunderland.
Yeah, I think lots of Liverpool fans I can say to you have reacted like particularly negatively to that first half actually
Yeah,
in that lots of people who have lots of faith in Slot and want to give him the benefit of the doubt, want to give him the time to turn this around, just found it like tactically baffling that
frustrating.
like
Yeah,
and that like 10 minutes in it was fairly obvious like that like Sunderland were just playing around it and there
yeah,
was there
they
was a way to solve it and actually probably wasn't a game to drop Kirkez and probably and
yeah
Gakpo and then I think he solved it. He waited till half time to address it and then I think of the first 10 minutes of the second half of it, oh yeah, great, now you're pinning Sunderland back and they
yeah
can't
yeah
do
yeah.
exactly what they were doing. So but it was baffling that
But
was
in the first half, it was like this 4-4-2 block where you had Isak and Wirtz in the front
yeah.
line, and they were up against like 3 or 4 players at any one point. But like between 26th and 22nd and the 26th minute, I noticed that there was a few phases where against Sunderland's build-up, they pushed Szoboszlai super high,
Mm.
and they then started competing 3v3 against the back line, but they then seemed to just completely lose touch with the left back, and so they were just playing around. So there's a few phases where you actually looked okay-ish, but then there was a
Yeah.
few. It genuinely looked to me like the players were trying to solve the issue on the fly. In that phase, it felt like Soboslai was like, "We can't do this. I'm going to step forward and play a little bit more advanced."
It's
They didn't. They
interesting.
did it for 4 minutes, and then it didn't kind of work. So they then fell back, and it just felt very. It felt quite worrying to me because it felt as though there was a lack of clear solutions from the
Yeah.
coaching staff, and so the players sort of took it into their hands a little bit.
Yeah, no, I think that's why I found it alarming. And what you mentioned there about Szoboszlai, I mean, he's definitely been Liverpool's best player this season. I think he's done a remarkable job in like multiple roles. But um, I have watched numerous games where he has done what you just mentioned there, gone to press and um, somehow sometimes won the press, sometimes not won the press, and often looked around and gone
Yeah, yeah,
like
yeah. He
that
was
too,
doing that in the Sunderland game as well,
like where are you?
and
And that to me
trying to get the players to step up as
and that
well.
to me was very worrying because I was like, so either they have been told to that do that
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they don't understand how to do that, uh, or they haven't been told to do that and you're
And they're
doing
trying to
it
work
because
it
you
out.
think
Yeah.
that's the way it's going to work.
Well, I
Um,
mean, I think it's something that has been notable at Slot's time at Liverpool that like first halves are often quite bad and they fix problems in the second half, which is,
yeah,
it's like I guess in some senses it's like nice to know that your coach can fix problems, but
yeah,
it's also worrying that your coach is going into games with the wrong tactical plan and then having to fix it on the fly.
yeah,
And I think we've seen that happening a little bit. I think the other thing, so the high press, like for me, the issue is that like Wirtz and Isak were getting just completely disconnected from the line behind them, and it
mm,
just gave Sunderland loads of time on the ball. And there's the Reggie Labrie quote saying we were surprised about how much time we had
yes,
on the ball, but also this ongoing problem of like man orientation in the midfield, which just allows opponents to manipulate your midfielders and create conditions that they want to create. And I
yeah,
see that happening all the time. And I think that's the reason why you've then been started to be picked off from second balls. Because if your midfield is that manipulable, in those sorts of phases, if the opponent goes long, then you can just collapse. You can just move the midfield away, and then make sure you've got the opponent have got other players arriving in to win those second balls, and then you just look completely exposed. And I think that's the reason why you've struggled more this season. Because I was looking through the beginning of your bad spell is like it's like Palace score very early on, Man United score very early on.
hmm
Almost all the games that you're playing in,
early
the
on.
opposition are scoring in the first 15 minutes because they're just being like, we don't even need to try and build up. We can go direct, win second balls, and then put you under pressure immediately. And it's like running directly at the back line, and
Yeah.
eventually that gives.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's so much hysteria, but like I am under the impression that actually Virgil van Dijk hasn't all of a sudden become a bad defender. I think he's all of a sudden become an incredibly exposed
Yeah, yeah,
defender.
absolutely, yeah.
And like he's getting a lot of stick for doing that kind of block that like half-hearted block that he does. He's been
Where he
doing that his
sticks his bum
entire
out and it
career.
like bounces off a part of him,
He's
doesn't
been
it?
doing
Yeah,
that his entire career
yeah,
because he's basically well, as far as I watched him at Liverpool, he's basically said, "Oh, you think you can beat Allison from 20, 29, 30 yards? Be my guest, try." Most of the time, he's not having to do that very often as well. So,
yeah,
and this season, all the time, and you've never seen him look so ragged because he's being pulled out all over the place.
yeah.
It's not your job to do this, John. So I'm not going to ask you to do this. But if I were to put you in the analysts group and you're in that Liverpool analysts group and thinking, okay, how do we like stop the bleeding, mitigate this for a little bit, and or even to sort of think about, okay, in January, okay, if there is money to spend or whatever, which is remarkable given how much money's been spent already. What do you where do you think the solution lies? Is it because people have obviously pointed to the some of the alarming signs around the coaching and the confusion amongst the players? There's some people who fall into the camp of this is an unbalanced squad, and actually the solutions are probably the easiest solutions are in the market to actually bring in a profile that makes it more balanced. Yeah, where do you sit?
Yeah, and again, look, far be it from me to
No,
pontificate about what the Liverpool coaching staff are doing, and I'm sure
they're all smart
their
people.
solutions will, yeah, exactly, their solutions would be much better than mine anyway. But I guess if I were to have any say on it, I guess I would just order priorities, and I think for me the main priority is sort the out of possession out
Yeah,
first, because the issue with the out of possession is that it's giving rise to game states where you are
we just can't.
necessarily less competitive, and that is breaking down lower blocks. Like I just watching the Sunderland game, just an inability to understand how to really pull apart a block like that, which I think is crazy given that you've got Wirtz now, which he's the perfect player to be doing that. I thought the way that he was used versus Sunderland was like, yeah, I didn't get I couldn't get my head around it because it felt as though they were trying to get him to push the last line a lot with Isak, whereas for me, he's the guy you have dropping off, constantly coming towards the ball, associating with the players around him, and finding ways of creating pockets of space within those blocks. Whereas, yeah, I think under slot, it felt very much like whenever you're faced with a low block, the only solutions you really have is, well, we'll work it wide and try and cross it into one of our strikers. You've got Florian Wirtz. He's one of the best players operating in those kind of scenarios. Make the most of him. So, yeah, for me, that would be the two things probably I would focus on. Number one would be sort out the defense, get into negative game states less often if you can, and as a result, you'll be able to run your approach from last season a lot more effectively.
Mm,
But if that doesn't come off, you've got to start finding solutions with the
the talent you've
incredible
got. Yeah,
players that you've got.
yeah,
Because if you gave Pep Guardiola this squad and told him to break down low blocks with it,
you'd
I
find a
think
way.
we would be talking very differently about this Liverpool squad. So
Yeah. So is your opinion on solving the defensive side of things that probably would lie in like an additional profile, or do you think that there is a combination that work?
I
Like, I
mean,
mean,
for sure, like if you get a large space defender, right, and you play him alongside Gravenberch, that midfield is going to look solid.
yeah,
And I don't think Szoboszlai has ever really looked great for me in that pivot spot. Not just from an in possession point of view, but an out of possession. Like his the advantages of Szoboszlai are get him in the forward areas. He'll run all day and he'll do the press, the front line of the press
yeah,
so
yeah.
well and cause teams problems in their build up. Then you want someone who's a more of a your Declan Rice profile
Mm,
behind with someone like Gravenberch to do some of the possession stuff, and I
yeah,
think that would be a much better midfield. That said, I do think that the solutions here in terms of the tactical structural approach to the defending.
yeah.
We've talked already about how there's just like this wild mania for man orientation, and that's a Dutch coach thing. I think a lot of Dutch coaches do that.
Mm,
Um, I think that you've got to ditch that and have or at least make it a lot. You've got to have a much more of a hybrid approach where the players understand when they should go and when they should leave a player to run off them.
yeah, because right
Um,
now they don't seem to understand
yeah,
that at all.
and you've got to work on second ball structure. You've got to the fact that like Gravenberch often, if the opponents are like building up on the left hand side, will drop into the back line,
Mm.
and then there's no one because the other two midfielders are
Yeah,
then man oriented. That
this
space opens out,
this
and we
happened against PSV, and it was the goal that I saw people criticizing Mo Salah for getting beaten on the wing,
yeah, yeah.
and then but I was like, oh, I'm not really too bothered about a 33-year-old winger getting beaten on the wing.
Yeah, and
I'm
your
mo-
whole system is built around that being a reality that will happen a lot, and you
I'm
get the
more worried
advantage of them
about the
being,
yeah, the
yeah,
gaping hole that the guy
yeah,
walked into afterwards and had time and space to pick a pass. Yeah, yeah, it seems baffling to me considering such a high-profile pursuit of players to play that kind of missing role. But we will see, and it seems like a game where both sets of fans are hoping their managers abandon their principle
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and,
yeah.
and play the way that seems
I
a bit
mean,
more
who knows?
obvious.
Who knows what will happen
Yeah, and so
in this one?
that's where I want to end. Kind of, we've been talking for a while. It says of, uh, uh, yeah, again, like I said a few weeks ago, maybe more than a few weeks ago, I was looking at this game, the timing of it, the fact that it was away from home, the profile of players Leeds have, the fragility that Liverpool have shown this season, and I thought, oh, all the ingredients for this to be just a horribly uncomfortable game, and that has not changed. My opinion has not changed on that. And actually, given where Liverpool are right now, I think this has the potential to be an incredibly damaging game for Slot personally as well. If he was to replicate some of the tactical stuff that we've spoken about. So I suppose, as a Leeds fan, you must be licking your lips a little bit about the opportunity here, at least.
Yeah, for sure. I don't know. I think I was not surprised that we beat Chelsea, to be honest,
Mm,
because I think our best. our best version is a team that is a game where we can sit in a mid block.
Yeah.
Um, and we're very similar to Palace, I would say, in that respect. In those games where we can sit in a mid block, we have a very active mid block, and when you're watching the game, you'll see this. Like the players always arrive, um, with dynamism into ball pressures because they're all starting low, pushing into, and then dropping off on the far side and resetting.
I thought the loss of Caicedo, I mean, in general, it's like
Yeah, I
it's a
mean,
big thing, but for that game in
Reese is
particular, I
such a
thought it
good
was
player.
oh
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. But I think that, Chelsea have struggled against mid blocks all
Yeah,
season anyway,
yeah.
working their way through them. And I think Leeds have a very good mid block. But I think it's probably slightly different with you guys because I feel as though one, you will if you try and bait our high press, we will press high. I think we can be pulled out of that mid block, and then you can find space in behind that. That's something that Chelsea just aren't going to do against us. But like potentially Liverpool could go quite direct against us, bait us high. I don't think our high press is necessarily that good,
Okay.
but we have very apt profiles for that, right? So if the players might not always have great access, but if they're given enough time to get access, then they will cause problems. But yeah, even in the mid block phase, I think that there's not enough teams so far who've really asked the question of like what happens when the winger pulls the Leeds wing back high, and then you've got a striker pinning the outside centre back, and then someone runs into that channel. Those are because Leeds will always track. They'll always be aggressive. They'll always step up. There is the possibility of opening out those spaces and finding joy in behind the press. Teams
Mm.
haven't really done that much against us, and I'm kind of interested to see if Liverpool will do that because I think of the elite sides, they're probably the most likely, apart from Man United, to really benefit from that, perhaps. Um, yeah, if we fall back into a low block, I think you'll be in trouble, especially if we're playing a back three, because we'll play Pascal Struijk, Joe Rodon, and Yaka Biol. We'll bring on Sebastian Bornau. Like there's no way that you're going to be able to just cross us into oblivion. In those, if that should happen,
Oh yeah.
so this is definitely going to
You'll
be a
give
game.
in. There'll just be such a
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wave of crosses, and
But
Cody
it'll be definitely a game where if Leeds get the first goal, you're in trouble. It's
we're
what
in real
happened with
trouble.
Chelsea, right? But
Yeah, and I
I
imagine Leeds
think
will do the same thing we've talked about, right? Just go, but know that they can just go super direct, win their second balls, and hurt us. And if they
yeah,
get that early goal, this is a Liverpool team that will. I think right now this is a Liverpool team that will crack.
yeah,
If
yeah.
that happens,
Yeah, and I think
um,
that I think Leeds will go
they'll
direct.
go for it.
They'll probably play the 5-3-2 again. They'll have. I mean, they played Nemetcha and Calvert-Lewin. They could play they could play Calvert-Lewin and Okafor and look for flicks in, runs behind.
Yeah, I
Um,
heard there were some doubts around those two, but maybe that's just Farke saying that
yeah, I mean, there definitely is some. I
oh,
mean, I don't think there's ever been doubts. At least in my mind, there's never been doubts about Calvert-Lewin's ability. Like
oh no,
Calvert-Lewin is going
physically,
to.
sorry, yeah, yes, yeah, it's
Yeah,
just
physically, sure, right. And I guess that's the gamble that you pay when you bring someone like him in. But I think in this sort of context, right, where and it could even be the case that he's injured. Actually, I do think that has picked up potentially a calf injury, so maybe he won't be playing. In which case, it will be, I guess, Nemetcha and Okafor up front, which will definitely suit. Because I think Calvert-Lewin is just a second ball cheat code, man. He's so good at competing with centre backs for either a flick on or just getting something on it, so the ball drops into that second ball area. Um, so if he's not playing, I think you should consider that to be like a good sign for
mm,
you guys. Um, but yeah, I think if they play, they'll probably play super direct in the first 15 minutes as well. It'd be super direct and intense. And yeah, I guess they'll try and get the early goal and then go from there. But if you can somehow get the first goal, then I guess that swings things, right? Because Leeds will then have to come out a little bit more and then there'll be more space in behind for you to go for.
yeah. No, I'm waiting for the day or the game now where just by the rules of math and probability, Liverpool score from a set piece. I'm hoping that happens sooner rather than later because it could solve quite a few problems just by
Yeah.
like giving yourself an easy goal once in a while. I think the number is currently something mad. I think like nearly 90 corners and no goals. I mean, obviously there was the Van Dijk one against City that was fine, but well,
And Leeds against Chelsea first goal set piece as well, right? So
yeah.
that's the sort of difference that changes the game, right?
Really does. It really does. Yeah. So we'll see. But I mean, yeah, I want to thank you, Johnny. I know we've been speaking for a while, and yeah, probably wrap up there in terms of looking at this. But yeah, tons of insight there, and also really appreciate your perspective on analyzing Liverpool as well, because I've tried to speak to as many people as possible who don't watch Liverpool all the time to talk about Liverpool, because
Mhm.
those who do watch Liverpool all the time, just like with any club you follow, you overanalyze your club to such an extent that it's nice at times for people to validate that you're not insane actually, and you
Mhm.
have been seeing some things.
It's
So
hard to see
yeah,
the wood from the trees, I think, when you're a fan covering a
yeah.
team.
No, I think it's going to be bumpy for a while for Liverpool. I think it's about getting to I think it's probably about getting to January, but whether Slot will be able to do that, I'm fascinated actually. I've no idea. I don't think the options are great out there necessarily. If he was to
Well,
be
there's always Xabi Alonso, right? I mean,
well,
that's
if
the
he yeah, if he goes and it's not working out, that would I can imagine the cogs turning right now. Like, oh, it'd be great to get the most out of this 120 million pound midfielder we signed. Who do we know who
yeah,
who can
who's
do,
already
could
done
do
that?
that?
Yeah,
Oh, and
absolutely.
Frimpong as well. Yeah, it'd be
Yeah,
interesting to know. Yeah, exactly. So the cogs are there, and I think the pressure is very much on. So I think Slot can definitely attest to that, given how he's played in the last few games. So, but anyway, thank you so much for coming on. Yeah, I know the listeners will love this as well. So yeah, really appreciate it.
thank you so much for having me on. It was fun. I like the space that you create for us to talk about things, so I appreciate you as well. So thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Really appreciate it.